Strange tales told by a Dubliner. Be Turlough con me. Story number 12. The ice gives up its dead. It may be surprising, but the people of the Alpine valleys have always shunned the high mountains as much as they could. They have a saying in Romansh, Ludar ils Alps, ishtar ele bassa, which means praise the heights but live down in the plains. The Alpine peaks are beautiful with their snowy summits, but neither the shepherd with his cows and sheep nor the huntsman in search of wild game will venture too far upwards. The high mountains are cursed with a sort of brooding taboo and are supposed to be the resort to supernatural presences that it's best not to inquire into too much. It's only in modern times that strangers, the mountain climber and the cross-country skier, have drawn some of the hardy local men up there to accompany them as guides on their tours and expeditions, and as hosts in the mountain chalets. The Caminada chalet is on a ridge overlooking a glacier. Look down and all you see is what seems to be a sea of ice. A little further down are the alpine pastures, green and ablaze with flowers of every hue in the summer, and much further down is the village of Panadoots, where the farmers, shepherds and huntsmen dwell. The glacier you see is actually a frozen river, a river of ice. And although it is frozen, it moves, but very slowly. It's alive. It buckles, it cracks, it rumbles, it crunches, it groans. Sometimes it breaks open like a wound in flesh, and there's a deep fissure called a crevasse. Unwary animals or humans crossing the glacier may not see the crevasse before they're upon it, and they fall in. For there are animals and humans crossing this sea of ice. There are chamois and steinbock from the high ground, and they gallop across the glacier on their way through the mountains. As for humans, there are hunters looking for those swift-footed animals out on the glacier. There are mountaineers and skiers on alpine tours who cross the glacier on their way from one mountain chalet to the next. There are even peasant farmers who have their herds grazing up this high during the summer months, and they have to go and tend them and make sure they don't get lost if they wander out on the glacier. All of them know they are on unsteady ground and need to be careful. Cold biting winds blow across the glacier for most of the year. They also bring snow, which covers the glacier ice, fills up the crevasses, leaving them as traps for the unwary, and sometimes comes rolling down from the heights in thundering avalanches. Any living thing that is absorbed by the glacier becomes a part of its frozen mass. And as the glacier is a river, it carries that frozen body slowly downwards, very slowly, maybe a few metres a year. In 100 years, the body will be 10 kilometres further down the slope. The glacier is both alive and dead. It is dead because it has a heart of ice, but it is alive because it moves. It groans, it cracks, it howls. It expands and contracts. It slowly drifts downwards. Pieces of it break off, and in the end, it melts. It shrinks. Over the past 25 years I have lived in these parts, I have witnessed for myself how the change in climate is changing the Alps. For one thing, the summers have got much warmer. There are regular heat waves that make people in the valleys want to escape up into the mountains, where the air is sure to be several degrees cooler. Only in some places now is there perpetual snow. The glaciers all through the Alps are shrinking. They have been shrinking for a long time, as historic photographs show. But the rate of shrinkage is faster now because of the hot summers and the winters that are often not as cold as they used to be. Some of the glaciers are disappearing. Perhaps they'll all disappear in the not too distant future. In the meantime, these shrinking, thinning glaciers are yielding up some of their oldest secrets. These are the bodies of them that were caught unawares and died, and then were sucked down into the ice. If they lie or fall on hard ice, the ice preserves them well enough, and they're mummified. If they fall on snow and are dragged down into the glacier, their bodies will be crushed, and their remains will be skeletal. Some of the bodies exposed by glacier melt are of relatively recent date. These would be people who disappeared within living memory, or whose disappearance was recorded in official records. But some are much older, people whose inexplicable absence dates from centuries ago. There are even prehistoric people preserved in the ice, preserved and mummified over a period of thousands of years. And what of the ones who are uncovered to the cold mountain air, be the melting of the snow and ice? Are their spirits frozen with them? Do they awake from a frozen sleep to a kind of living death? They died a death they were least expecting. They have slept long, frozen in the ice, and the world has gone on without them. Now the light of heaven calls them back to time and place. What are they to do? Where are they to go? A middle-aged couple went out looking for their cows one night in 1942. Their name was Hausberger. It was Hans and his Marie. They had 7 children. He was a shoemaker in the village, and she was a primary teacher. They also had a farm with a herd of cows. The cows were up on the high alpine pasture, and they both went up one evening to check on them. The cows were valuable, as everything contributed to survival in them years when war raged in the nations around neutral Switzerland. It was the middle of August. Nothing could go wrong. They located most of the little herd by the loud clanging of their cowbells as they grazed on the pasture not far from the glacier. But they could tell from distant clanging that 1 or 2 had wandered out on the glacier and would have to be herded in. They went out together after them. They were walking over what seemed to be hard-packed snow when it suddenly gave way beneath them. They tumbled into a crevasse. They were both stunned by the fall, and after the temperatures dropped in the darkest hours of the night, they froze. In time, a fresh fall of snow covered over the crevasse they had fallen into. It was dawn, and they woke up shivering. The sun came up over the snowy peaks and shone on the glacier. They got up out of their bed of snow and looked at one another in puzzlement. They'd spent the night on the mountain without intending to. They looked around. What was there to do but go down to the village? They hoped the children were all right during the night, that the older ones had banked the fire and got all of them to bed at a reasonable hour. They picked their way across the hard snow with the ice underneath. Eventually, they got off the glacier and found a rough mountain pathway going down the mountainside. They followed it. Soon the village came in sight, smoke rising from a few chimneys, the familiar spire of the village church. They walked through the deserted streets. It was still very early. They made their way to their house. They hoped the children had been sensible in their absence, that the older ones had got the younger ones ready for school, for it was just the beginning of a new school year. One of the other teachers would have to take Marie's class until she could get there. They arrived at the house. It looked quite different. There was a different door, and the shutters were painted a different colour from what they remembered. In front of the house was a strange-looking automobile. They looked curiously at the nameplate on the mailbox. It said, J. Shorter. They looked at each other in puzzlement. For a long time they stood like that out on the street in front of the house. Then they just seemed to fade away. Jochen Shorter, who had owned the farm for 10 years, noticed the middle-aged couple, who sometimes came and stood shyly on the street outside his house, looking in puzzlement at the adjacent barn. They were both carrying rucksacks on their backs. He felt the urge to go over and ask them what they wanted or what their problem might be. The first few times he was just too busy working at the barn. When he finally found the time to approach them, they just seemed to fade away. This happened a few times, at different times of the day or night. He was baffled. He had no idea who these people might be. He was also made uneasy by the fact that they disappeared into thin air whenever he got near them. He asked his wife. He asked the neighbours. He asked some local people. No one could say who they were. Maybe gypsies passing through? They seemed harmless enough. And so it remained. The Hausberger children had grown up, cared for by relatives, and they always wondered what had happened to their parents that night. In time, they could hardly remember what their parents had looked like. They were so absent from their growing lives. The 7 of them had grown to maturity, married, and had children. Some moved away, some had stayed in the village. They had lived their lives out and died. There was only one adult child left, the youngest, a daughter, who was an old woman of 80. Her name was Francine. She had always wanted to know what had happened to her parents. 3 times she'd gone up to the glacier as a grown woman to see if she could find them. When the stories began to circulate around the village about the middle-aged couple coming to look at Jochen Shorter's house, Francine realised that that had been her parents' house when she and the others were children. She went to Jochen Shorter and asked him to show her the people he saw. She felt awkward asking him, and he felt bewildered by her request, but he promised to let her know when they were there next. A few nights later, Jochen phoned old Francine and said that they were there, out in front of his barn, looking at him. She lived just a 5-minute walk from there as it happened, and as she turned the corner into the old street, she saw Jochen standing in front of the door of his house. She went and joined him. Jochen said not a word, but pointed out into the street in front of his barn. There she saw 2 shadowy people, a man and a woman, standing on the edge of the street. She looked at them for a long time. She said to Jochen quietly, "It's them." Though his instinct was to hold her back, she left his side and walked across the front yard towards them. But when she reached the edge of the street, Jochen could see no one there but old Francine. Martin Senti was a young man who went out hunting in the mountains above the village. Also out there hunting on the same day was Gieri Caduff, his rival for the affections of Anna Derungs, a local girl. Gieri had enjoyed her affections for a year and hoped to marry her, but Senti had come along and drawn her away from him one night at carnival. When Gieri saw him out on the slopes, he was filled with an unreasoning hatred. He was not thinking normally as he began to follow him across the glacier. A mad plan was forming in his mind. He would rid himself of this rival once and for all, and no one in the village would be any the wiser. With Martin Senti out of the way, Anna would come back to him and he would marry her. Gieri had known Martin for so long. They had grown up in the village together, played on the streets, engaged in the same sports. But all this did not matter now. Martin stood between Gieri and his Anna, and he had to be got rid of. Gieri went on stalking Martin Senti for an hour, never letting him out of his sight. But it would soon be dusk. His aim was good, but in the failing light he might miss his shot and the whole plan would be ruined. There was no time to be wasted. He knelt behind a pile of hard snow to steady his rifle as Martin walked clearly across the windy glacier ahead of him. He fired twice and saw Martin go down. Gieri strode quickly across the hard snow till he came upon the body. Martin Senti lay on his chest, a pool of blood around him. His glazed, unmoving eyes showed he was dead. Both shots had gone home, as Gieri could see. He looked around. He dragged the body a little way to a depression in the ice and tumbled the body into it. He went back and took Martin's rifle and game bag and threw them in after the body. Then he covered him over with snow and obscured the traces of his fall. Here there would be intermittent snowfall soon, and any tracks would soon disappear. Gieri shouldered his own rifle and headed for the path down to the village. It was September 1969. Martin Senti was never seen again. He had just disappeared. People did disappear like that out on the mountains. Now Martin awoke. The snow melted from him somewhere on the glacier. He got up and looked around. Slowly the memory of what had happened came back to him. He had been shot. He didn't know who had done it, but he knew that he needed to go back down to the village to find out. So he set out on his way. He walked unsteadily down the mountain track as the sun rose over the glacier. Finally, he was down in the village. He wandered about the deserted streets, undecided what to do. Then he saw a house ahead of him. It was the house of someone he knew well, Gieri Caduff. His name was on the gatepost, and everything looked familiar. He walked up to the house and knocked at the door. There was no answer. Perhaps Gieri was outside in the barn working. So he walked around the side of the house, and sure enough, He heard some sort of activity inside the barn. He went in, and in the semi-darkness he saw the eyes of the cows looking at him mistrustfully. After a while, the Caduff's dog came around the corner. He looked up at Martin, began to bark at the unfamiliar figure, but the bark died in his throat. It changed into a whine. And the dog turned and slunk away. Martin followed him, and around the corner of the cattle pen he saw a human figure rising from a stooped position where he had been working at a piece of farm equipment. It was an elderly, white-haired man who stood and looked at him. At first the look was uncomprehending, then bewildered, finally terrified. Later in the day, several people coming around to the Caduff house got no answer. The dog appeared, whining, and went back into the barn. Finally, someone thought of going out into the barn and found Gieri Caduff lying on his back on the ground. He was dead. His face was contorted with fear. It seemed to all who looked upon him that the old widower had died of fright. A group of 6 people went on a ski tour in the high Alps in March 1926. They were all members of the same family, the Caminadas, from the neighbouring village of Ötzi. The weather was good when they made their ascent, and when they stayed overnight at the Caminada chalet overlooking the glacier. But when they left the next day and started crossing the glacier, they had the great misfortune to be overtaken by a foehn storm. The foehn is a warm wind that blows through the Alps and alpine valleys. It's usually a warm wind, not a cold one, but when it blows in the higher reaches, it can attain speeds of over 100 kilometres per hour very quickly. Then it whips up any loose snow that is on the ground and creates a blizzard. To be caught out in a foehn storm is a disaster for a mountain climber or a cross-country skier. The 6 travellers were immobilised and disoriented by the blizzard. The temperature went down below freezing very quickly. They were trapped out on the glacier. They did not have the right clothing to withstand a night bivouacking out in the open like that. It seems that they tried to build themselves a shelter, a snowbank that they could huddle behind, but they didn't even have the right kind of snow shovels that could break through the hard snow on the glacier. A relative named Leonard Caminada, who was going to meet them in the village they were headed to after their planned descent, alarmed the cantonal police when they failed to appear after several hours. No rescuers were able to go up to the glacier until 2 days had passed. Conditions were so bad. The bodies were never found. No doubt they froze to death and were buried in a fall of snow which followed the foehn storm. But now they did come awake. They were exposed to the sunlight of morning on the Alps, more than 10 kilometres away from the spot where they had died nearly a century before. They had no idea where they were. They numbly staggered to their feet, looking around at each other and picking up any of their packs and equipment that had accompanied them down the glacier. They looked all around. The sun was up. They could take their approximate burdens. Without exchanging a word, they put on their skis and resumed their trek across the glacier. Leaving it after a while, they shouldered their skis and hiked slowly down to the village where they were supposed to make rendezvous with a relative, Leonard Caminada, who was expecting them. They had a vague feeling of being late. It was night time when they arrived on the village square. They stood there on the square in a group, leaning on their upright skis and dropping their packs to the ground. A man working as a receptionist at the nearby hotel saw them standing there and wondered if they were guests, and if so, if they were coming in. But he was busy, alone at the desk, attending to calls from the rooms above. By the time he could slip away and go out on the square, they disappeared. But now, on many a night in early spring, it seems, they can be seen standing on the square. People pass them by without paying attention. But sometimes someone, a local, will try to approach them. They just seem to vanish into thin air before he can get close to them. Finally, let me tell you about someone who had been there much longer than the others. In fact, he was crossing the glacier southwards one day 3,000 years ago, when he was struck down by his killer. He had caught a glimpse of some huntsmen far off on the glacier, local men they must be from down in the valley, maybe hoping to get some game birds or a chamois. He decided to ignore them. There was no point in trying to talk to them. They were foreigners. He needed no help from them anyway. He was just travelling through on his way across the Alps to the plains of the south. He was looking for the pass that would take him that way. He knew it was a bit above the glacier on a ridge he could see. That was where he made for now. He had travelled for a couple of hours and had long lost sight of the stranger hunters he had seen earlier. He wasn't thinking of them as he stepped off the glacier ice and began to climb an animal track that was leading to the pass. But they had not ceased to be preoccupied with him. They had watched his every movement, taking care to keep out of sight themselves. They could see he was a hunter, armed with a bow and a long knife, a sharpened stone, dressed in a leather jacket and trousers, and boots made of animal skin. They were angry to see a stranger huntsman striding boldly across their hunting territory. They might challenge him, but what was the point? He wouldn't understand what they were saying, because he was a stranger from far away. Perhaps he was scouting out a path for others of his kind. Perhaps he might be guiding a force of invaders. It was better to kill him and be done with it, they thought. This was agreed between them in an undertone. After that, they never lost sight of him. As he climbed the path off the glacier, suspecting nothing, he became an easy target for an arrow. The other hunters were within bowshot. One stood up and let off an arrow at him. It was well aimed, for it hit him in the back, went through his shoulder and severed an artery. At the same time, 2 other huntsmen let off arrows, but they missed their target and their arrows went wide. The man fell from the exposed place where he was standing and pitched back down onto the ice of the glacier. The group emerged from hiding and marched across to where the man was now lying. There was a pool of blood all around him. He was already dead. They could see that from his staring eyes. The huntsman who had brought him down retrieved his arrow from the body, and the 2 others found their arrows on the ground nearby and retrieved them too, for arrows were valuable and could be reused. They stood looking at the dead man now. His long bow was still across his shoulder, his stone knife hung by his side, and he was carrying a leather bag across his chest that seemed to have personal effects in it. One of the men knelt down and looked at it, but he was overcome by a feeling of superstitious dread. Any thought he and his companions had of despoiling him had evaporated. The kneeling man looked up sorrowfully at the others now, and they shook their heads. He was the one who had fired the lethal shot, and the others wanted no part of it. It was unlucky. So, muttering, he got to his feet and shouldered his bow and put on his snowshoes. Should they bury him? He asked the others. No, they said. Soon more snow would come and cover him, and he wouldn't be seen again. He would be absorbed into the glacier the way dead bodies were, and that would be the last of him. They turned and left him. They went back to their hunting on the glacier. Now the sun had risen, and the dead man stirred from the snow and ice. 3,000 years had passed, and the glacier had absorbed him and turned him into a mummy. His face and limbs and body were carefully preserved, except that they had shrunk and become leathery and blackish. Some part of his leather jacket and trousers remained, as did the shoes on his feet. He sat up. He had his bow, his knife, his leather bag, and his quiver of arrows all within reach around him. He gathered them quickly and rose to his feet. He looked around, wondering where he was. In the course of 3,000 years, the glacier had been flowing inch by inch down the mountain. It had carried him a long way, and now he was at the mouth of the glacier where it ended. He seemed to be in a sort of cave of ice, with the sound of groaning and water dripping. There was the mouth of the cave, and there was light shining in, so he started forward and made for that. Now he stood at the entrance, blinking. Then he was out of the glacier, standing on rocks from which the snow had partly melted. The sun was rising in the east over the alpine peaks. What had happened? It came back to him. He'd been struck down by an enemy, an assassin. It must have been one of the shadowy huntsmen he had seen out on the glacier a couple of hours before. His eyes blazed slowly with anger. He would get even with them. It would take him out of his way to go down the mountain, where they must have their settlement. But he had been travelling alone now for so long that a day wouldn't make a difference. He had a quiver full of bone-tipped arrows. His knife was sharp. He shouldered his bow resolutely. He started down the mountain. There was a well-worn track he could follow, obviously used by men as well as wild animals. He took his time. He didn't yet feel all that steady on his feet. By the time he reached what he took to be the local settlement, it was mid-afternoon. He walked out into the village. What strange huts they lived in! The huts seemed to be arranged in rows. He heard cows lowing from inside a barn. So these were men who kept herds of animals. He knew about them. Well, he would slaughter an animal and feast on its meat as soon as he had done slaughtering the treacherous, inhospitable men that kept them. After a while, he saw a woman come out of a house. He would ignore her. He drew back into the shadow of a tree. After she'd gone, he waited a while. A man came out of a barn leading a cow. Well, here would be his first victim. He stepped out to confront him. The man was clearly unarmed, but he would show no mercy. He reached over his shoulder, took off his bow, and drew an arrow from his quiver. The movements attracted the notice of the man. He looked up and saw the stranger. They looked at one another for several seconds. Then the man let out a scream of terror and fled down the street, leaving the cow to graze on a patch of grass. The stranger laughed to himself. What a coward! But now this fellow would go and tell the other locals, and they would come out looking for him in greater numbers. Well, let them. It would just make it easier for him to shoot them down. He would make short work of them all. He saw several of the local people, both men and women, in the course of the afternoon. They all seemed to be unarmed, and they all screamed and turned and fled when they saw him. What was it about him, he wondered, that inspired such panic fear? Meantime the dusk was coming in. He saw a herd of cows being herded by men from a field into a barn. When he approached, the men fled in terror, calling to one another in an unknown language. In the meantime, strange lights were appearing inside the huts. He walked down a street and saw a woman open a door and come out. When she stepped onto the street, she saw the stranger. She emitted a blood-curdling scream and ran in the opposite direction down the darkened street. Now people could be seen looking out the openings in the walls of several huts and calling to one another in alarm. He was getting tired of this. None of these cowards would come out and fight. His detour had been in vain. He turned away in disgust and made his way out of the village in the darkness. At the edge of the settlement, he turned. He searched in his bag and brought forth a crudely carved amulet. He held it up and pronounced a mighty curse on the villagers and any of them who might dare to attack him again. Then he turned on his heel and began to climb the mountain. Soon he would be back on the glacier and heading over the pass. He turned all the events that had happened over in his mind, but could make no sense of them. For the first time on his long journey through the Alps, the traveller felt lonely and bereft of all comfort for his soul. Do not go out on the glacier at night, is what the villagers have told me over the years. You'll hear strange sounds from the ice beneath you, cracks and howls and rumbles, so that you think the ground is unsteady under your feet and start to feel dizzy. What is more, you may meet frightening presences out on the glacier that look like white frozen men and women. Do not speak to them. Do not stop if they speak to you, and do not follow them if they beckon to you. They may want to lure you onto a snow-covered crevasse, so you can join them down there in the embrace of death. Or they may just want your company on their journey through the mountain passes. But it'll be a journey that never ends. No, not for thousands of years. For these are people who have fallen out of time, and their dwelling is not a consecrated grave, but the caverns of snow and ice that hold them in their stony grip, slowly advancing downwards year by year. They long to live in the time of the living again, but that can never be. In dying up here on the glacier, they have stepped outside time, and theirs is an almost eternity of rock and ice and cold that will last until every glacier is gone and the Alps are a dusty blazing desert from which man has disappeared for good. You've been listening to The Ice Gives Up Its Dead by Turlough on Me from Strange Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.